So thank you very much for joining me on this video. These YouTube videos are watched pretty much across the country, throughout the United States, and even over in Europe. So I need to kind of apologize to the viewers who are not local, because from time to time I'm going to be dealing with topics that are specific to maybe Niagara or specific to the province of Ontario, and that's what I'm going to be doing today. I'm going to be talking about something that's Ontario-wide legislation. But having said that, I find that various jurisdictions steal from each other. I'm going to be talking in a week or two about cash for keys, and I discovered that one landlord in LA was talking about the cash for keys phenomenon. And so it may not be in your area if you're not in Ontario, but that doesn't mean it won't be. If you're in Ontario, you'll know that there's a significant shortage of housing. Those of us in real estate are acutely aware of that. Certainly if we're representing a tenant and helping them find lodging, it's tough, and they're very expensive. And single-family homes wanting to purchase are a little bit scarce, and I think it's probably even more acute in Toronto, where that's the kind of the epicenter for immigration, but all over there's a scarcity of housing. And so the Government of Ontario, under the Ministry of Municipal Affairs and Housing, has brought out legislation to deal with this. The legislation is, interestingly enough, called More Homes Built Faster Act 2022. More Homes Built Faster Act. Let me tell you their goal. Their goal is to build 1,500,000 new homes over the next 10 years. If it was uniformly done, that would be 150,000 homes a year. Now, to put this in perspective, the best year they've had over the last 30 years was 2021, in which case they had just over 100,000 new home starts. So that means they're looking at 50% higher than the highest year they've had in the last 30 years, and they're planning on doing it every year for the next 10 years. That's very, very ambitious. Well, let me tell you that some of the highlights of this new act. One of the things, and it might not seem like that much, but they're going to require a little less land dedicated for parks when somebody develops a new subdivision. Right now, for every 300 units, there has to be 1 hectare set aside for parks. Well, they're changing that to 1 hectare for every 600 units. What that means is they can build a little bit more housing on any large parcel of land. And what they're going to do to try and compensate is develop more parkland in encumbered land, like maybe a railway, an unused railway right-of-way or something like that. They're also reducing developmental costs on rental housing and on affordable housing. They're going to do what they can about reducing borrowing costs for developers and builders. They're going to provide government incentives, and they're also going to reduce red tape. But going beyond that, tinkering with the Planning Act, they've brought out Regulation 299/19. 299/19. That's what I really want to talk about today. As you know, some time ago, they brought out legislation to allow what we called granny flats. Now, for years, people have had, and we in the real estate industry have talked about in-law apartments. And what that means is it's a family member that's living with maybe the children, that's maybe retired parents in there, and they've had a second apartment, which isn't really legal, but it's been usable for a family composition. And then the government moved one step beyond that some time ago with these granny flats. And they said, if you've got a home in a low-density R1, for example, zoning that doesn't permit duplexes, we will allow you to have a secondary dwelling within your home, and we're relaxing some of the standards. For example, parking could be tandem. You could have one car parked behind the other. Side yard and setback requirements were eased up. And even you could get into that unit by going through part of the house, and that was okay. As long as it met fire standards so that there wasn't a fire danger to them, then people could do that. And the government was trying to address the fact that, first of all, there was a serious shortage of housing, and secondly, they recognized there were people that were home rich and cash poor, maybe elderly people or maybe single parents, and the additional rent coming in from an ancillary dwelling in the house made a huge difference. But I wanted to stress that it was not a duplex. If the owner of the house sold the house and an investor bought it, he couldn't legally function as a duplex. Now, he might not get caught and he may go ahead with it, but it wasn't a legal duplex. Well, now all of a sudden, we've got this new legislation, and there's a number of things that are very, very pertinent I want you to be aware of. The first is that now they've stepped it up, so instead of one additional unit in the property, there can be two. And they're saying it can either be two additional apartment units within the house or dwelling, or it can be one additional one inside and an ancillary dwelling outside, like a little tiny house in the back, or like a garage converted to dwelling, and that's okay. Again, they're saying zoning isn't an issue. It can be low density R1 zoning. That's not a problem. Parking, need one parking spot per unit, but it can be tandem. And if the property we're talking about to start with doesn't have parking and doesn't require parking, then you can add the apartment units and they won't require parking as well. Also, again, stress the same as the granny flats, both these units, additional units, can be rented out arm's length. It doesn't have to be a family member. But here's an interesting thing. They're also saying that the owner of the property doesn't have to reside in the property, and that's huge. So unlike the granny flats we talked about before, where they weren't actually legal duplex, this makes the property a legal triplex or a legal duplex, whichever you're doing. And so an investor can go ahead and acquire this kind of a property. And in fact, there's models going out like that. There's real estate corporations and there's developers who are looking for properties where the municipality has already enacted this legislation, where they can find a property that can be easily created into a triplex. They've come up with the cost of acquiring the property, the cost of renovation, the projected cost of rent, and then they invite investors to go and buy a turnkey operation. And that brings another interesting thing. There's no restriction on the age of the dwelling. We know that if a property is built after 2019, I think it's October or November, it doesn't come under rent controls. Well, regardless of the age of the dwelling, because the units are new, they don't come under rent control. And so that's a real bonus as well. Also, the type of property, it can be a detached, it can be a semi-detached, it can be a townhouse. Now, they've given each municipality the right to implement this on their own and apply their own bylaws, but they've made it clear that the bylaws shouldn't be repressive. They shouldn't defeat the spirit of the legislation. So what they're looking at is maybe easing up on encroachments such as decks and porches, looking at side yard and setback requirements, and so on. And a lot of municipalities are inviting input. Interestingly enough, here in St. Catharines, I spoke to the planning department, and I said, you know, this is huge because there's properties in the area that are duplexes, and they really are set up to easily add a third apartment, and now they'll be able to do that. And the city said, well, no, it doesn't apply to duplexes. Well, you got to scratch your head over that one. I said, you mean if you've got a home that's a single-family home, is how it's registered in the city, it was created a duplex years ago, but it's never been registered as such, then they can add a third apartment and make a triplex. But if they registered it as a duplex, they can't. And they said, yeah, that's correct. So you're going to find in your municipality there's some strange things happening, some peculiarities that need to be ironed out. But I think it's a giant step forward. What it does mean, though, if you're sitting comfortably in your R1 zone with your lovely home, the home next door may suddenly become a triplex, and it will become a legal triplex. Thank you very much for joining me in this video. Look forward to talking to you again next week.